So Matthew 16, beginning with verse 13. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. These are the words of God, and they are for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Any minister who is being honest will tell you that at some point in their Christian journey, they had a moment of sudden realization where they said either aloud or to themselves, "What in the world am I doing? I don't believe a word of this Jesus stuff. I mean, it's a fairy tale." I know that's hard to hear that, but all ministers think that at some point. One of my moments happened nearly 2 years ago when, struggling through some personal issues, I found God to be rather silent in my pleading. So out loud, with no one else around the house, I said those words, or something to that effect. I remember saying those words quietly because I didn't want anybody else to hear that I was saying them. But as they came out of my mouth, I remember feeling as if I were standing over the Grand Canyon and all of the world could hear me saying those words. The good news is that in the very next moment, I thought, except throughout my life, I have experienced God to be true. The reality is that I experience the gospel to be true even when I can't believe it with my head. And honestly, sometimes I believe the gospel in my head when I don't experience it in my heart. And I suggest to you today that this is why we have, and even why we need, the Word and the sacrament and the local church. Because you see, we are a forgetful people. And it is to this office of the gospel, of word and sacrament, expressed in the local church, that you, Matthew Nelson, have been called. So I feel like in an ordination sermon, the preacher should in some way address the level of preparedness of the person being ordained. And I am in a position to do just that. So here we go. You, Matthew Nelson, have demonstrated great gifts intellectually, pastorally, and theologically. You and Alice have left your mark on Central Baptist Church as youth and worship minister, and we are the better for it. Before you got here, you successfully completed all the requirements for your Master of Divinity. You have learned to do pastoral care by text message and in person. You have learned to pretend how not to be bored when you're at staff meeting. You have learned how to plan worship and to lead traditional people in contemporary music. You have learned to admit when you're wrong, but not too often. You have learned to forgive, and you have learned how terrifying grace really is. You have learned what it feels like to pastor broken people as a broken person. You have learned how to learn. You have learned how beautiful and maddening the people of God can be. So if I am asked if you are prepared to be ordained and to hold the office of minister of the word and sacrament, the only answer is, of course you're not. Don't be ridiculous. But before you take this personally, you should know that this is true of every minister. This is true of me. We don't have what it takes. But like all of us who have ever heard the call of God on our lives and have responded to that call, you do have the God that it takes. And thank God for that. Because we are in perhaps the most uniquely challenging and opportune times that the church has ever known, where our survival, and more importantly, our revival, are beyond our action and capacity. As bright and thoughtful as you are, and the generation of ministers that you are a part of, the answers for our next steps will require God's creative action through us. And that is why this story that we just read matters so much. Upon this rock will I build this church, Jesus says. And in and of itself, that will preach. Except knowing Greek, the way that I know that you do, Jesus has just spoken those words to Peter, which in Greek is Petros, which means rock. So it is not just that Jesus is saying, upon this rock. Jesus is also saying, upon this Peter will I build my church. Upon this Matthew will I build my church. Wow. I can understand that. This, after all, is Peter, who boldly spoke before the disciples in saying that Jesus was the Messiah. That's an act of great faith when there's all the mystery around Jesus. This is Peter, who boldly stepped out of the boat and actually walked on water, more than any other disciple can say. This is Peter, who defiantly told Jesus that he would never betray him. But this is also Peter, who rebuked Jesus when he didn't fit into Peter's mold for what he thought a Messiah should look like. This is Peter, who took his eye off of Jesus and sank when he considered the storm around him. This is Peter, who after the cock crowed had denied Jesus not once, but 3 times. And so it is with all of us, with you, Matt. You, like all of us, ministers included, are a mix of great gifts and great faith, but also great shortcomings. God knows that. God knows you. And God still says to you, upon this Matthew Nelson will I build my church. It will not be your perfection, your competence, your talent that will make you a transformational minister. It will be your willingness to be broken, like Peter on the shore with Jesus after the resurrection. It will be your willingness to work with broken people, a broken church, and a broken world that God will take hold of, along with your gifts and talents, and build the church of Jesus Christ. And so with that in mind, just a couple of important thoughts. As you go, you will be prophetic to the church by whom you choose to be priestly to. Those who you love and build relationships with will speak the words of God to people, even without having to speak a word. Likewise, you will be priestly to the church, by whom you choose to be prophetic to. God's prophecy is not intended to destroy, but to build up in grace and mercy. And your willingness to speak prophetic words to God's people is the ultimate act of priestly grace. Someone named Matthew Nelson once wrote in his seminary capstone paper these words: "Calling Jesus Messiah is to claim that Jesus is the fulfillment of the deep hope that God would produce an ideal king for Israel, a king who would fulfill every hunger of the nation for well-being, one who would bring peace, wisdom, righteousness, and prosperity. These days, we would replace the word nation and Israel with the world, but those hopes still ring true. In our hopes for what God will do through God's church. As Reverend Matthew Nelson, you are an instrument, and you are a representative of God to bring the kingdom, the reign of God, here on earth as it is in heaven. And in your priestly and prophetic functions, great power to transform the world is upon you. May you go, Matt, as one of God's people, set aside for the work of God, but set aside to be a part of God's people. May the Lord bless you, and may the Lord keep you all of your days. Amen.